Natural Selection, Irrationality, Behavioral Economics, and Neoclassical Economic Theory, Part 3, written by Spencer Antonio Marlen-Starr, originally published on May 30th, 2024, on my Medium blog under my name. This article is the third and final in this brief series of 3 articles. The links are in that article. Introduction. This article, the last of my 3-part series, focuses on Milton Friedman's 1953 paper, The Methodology of Positive Economics, and what implications his arguments have on behavioral economics, especially when they are combined with the analysis in the previous 2 articles. The Methodology of Positive Economics is considered the most famous, or most infamous if you prefer, influential paper on methodology in all of economics. Many fascinating and original arguments are put forth in this paper, but it is best known for Friedman's as-if argument. Briefly, from the man himself and the paper in question, quote, "Consider the problem of predicting the shots made by an expert billiard player. It seems not at all unreasonable that excellent predictions would be yielded by the hypothesis that the billiard player made his shots as if he knew the complicated mathematical formulas that would give the optimum directions of travel, could estimate accurately by the eye, the angles, etc., describing the location of balls, could make lightning calculations from the formulas, and could then make the balls travel in the direction indicated by the formulas. Our confidence in this hypothesis is not based on the belief that billiard players, even expert billiard players, can or do go through the process described. It derives rather from the belief that unless, in some way or another, they were capable of reaching essentially the same result, they would not in fact be expert billiard players. It is only a short step from these examples to the economic hypothesis that under a wide range of circumstances, individual firms behave as if they were seeking rationally to maximize their expected returns, generally, if misleadingly called profit, and had full knowledge of the data needed to succeed in this attempt, as if, that is, they knew the relevant cost and demand functions, calculated marginal cost and marginal revenue from all actions open to them, and pushed each line of action to the point at which the relevant marginal cost and marginal revenue were equal." End of quote. Crucially, though, Friedman goes right on after this to clarify what he does not mean. And this is great because negative clarifications can be even more helpful than positive clarifications, in my opinion. Quote, "Now, of course, businessmen do not actually and literally solve the system of simultaneous equations in terms of which the mathematical economist finds it convenient to express this hypothesis, any more than leaves or billiard players explicitly go through complicated mathematical calculations or falling bodies decide to create a vacuum. The billiard player, if asked how he decides where to hit the ball, may say that he just figures it out, but then also rubs a rabbit's foot just to make sure, and the businessman may well say that he prices at average cost, with of course some minor deviations when the market makes it necessary. One statement is about as helpful as the other, and neither is a relevant test of the associated hypothesis." End of quote. ... Skipping over some of his quote. Despite, this is my commentary, despite the iconic status of this paper, though, many economists who have only ever read it once, never read it carefully, or who have terrible memories like myself, might not be aware that it actually offers a natural selection, that is, evolutionary argument as well, and at least 2 of its footnotes reference Alchian's 1950 paper. In the next paragraph, after the one quoted above, as I have done throughout this article, I will quote the paragraph in full below. Quote, "Confidence in the maximization of returns hypothesis is justified by evidence of a very different character. This evidence is in part similar to that adduced on behalf of the billiard player hypothesis. Unless the behavior of businessmen in some way or other approximated business consistent with the maximization of returns, it seems unlikely that they would remain in business for long. Let the apparent immediate determinant of business behavior be anything at all, habitual reaction, random chance, or whatnot. Whenever this determination happens to lead to behavior consistent with rational and informed maximization of returns, the business will prosper and acquire resources with which to expand. Whenever it does not, the business will tend to lose resources and can be kept in existence only by the addition of resources from outside. The process of natural selection thus helps to validate the hypothesis, or rather, given natural selection, the acceptance of the hypothesis can be based largely on the judgment that it summarizes appropriately the conditions for survival. End of quote. As you can see, the case for predictive validity being the only criterion which counts in selecting hypotheses is complemented by Alchian's model of economic environments, adopting the most fit firms ex post, rather than all of them rationally adapting to it with perfect foresight. Why are they complementary? Because both Alchian's model and the standard neoclassical economic model make very accurate predictions about a wide range of economic phenomena. Until the day that behavioral economists put forth their own general theory of how economies work, which has as wide or nearly as wide a number of different use cases and makes predictions as accurate or more than supply and demand analysis, I don't want to hear another peep out of them. Next section. Irrelevant but neat observation about this paper from Friedman. There's also a really interesting argument Friedman makes in this paper, which anticipates the underlying reason why cross-validation, which is a method of automated regression specification selection commonly used in modern statistical learning algorithms, randomly splitting samples into training and testing sets, and even model tuning. Friedman's supposition in the following quote below is correct, and if it were not, cross-validation would not work. Quote, the two stages of constructing hypotheses and testing their validity are related in two different respects. In the first place, the particular facts that enter at each stage are partly an accident of the collection of data and the knowledge of the particular investigator. The facts that serve as a test of the implications of a hypothesis might equally well have been among the raw material used to construct it. This is a parenthetical note from me. This is how k-fold cross-validation works. The parameters are tuned by alternating between which facts, i.e. observations or data points, are serving as a test set for them and which are being used to fit or train them. And a parenthetical note from me. And conversely. End of quote from Friedman. And this next quote undergirds sample splitting in the same way. Quote, to avoid confusion, it should perhaps be noted explicitly that the predictions by which the validity of a hypothesis is tested need not be about the phenomena that have not yet occurred. That is, need not be forecasts of future events. They may be about phenomena that have occurred but observations on which have not yet been made, or are not known to the person, parenthetical note from me, or in the machine learning context, not known by statistical learning algorithm, which is only trained on a subset of the available data, and of parenthetical note, making the prediction. For example, a hypothesis may imply that such and such must have happened in 1906, given some other known circumstances. If a search of the records reveals that such and such did not happen, the prediction is confirmed. If it reveals that such and such did not happen, the prediction is contradicted. End of quote. Of course, during the late 30s and during World War II, Milton Friedman was a professional statistician, and he even came up with and introduced a novel non-parametric statistical hypothesis test of ranks, now called the Friedman test, for which there remains no superior substitute in the particular circumstances to which it applies to this day, so perhaps it is not as surprising as it would have been if another great economist, say F.A. Hayek, had said the same thing in one of his papers. Next section. Crucial paper, understanding what Friedman's paper really means. There was a paper written by the Austrian-born economist Thomas Mayer, published in 1993, called Friedman's Methodology of Positive Economics, a Soft Reading, which, in my view, completely clarifies most common quarrels about Friedman's paper. If you have any trouble at all finding a copy of this paper, ask for my email and comment under this article, and when I give it to you, then send me an email. I'll send you a PDF of it, or you can listen to me read that paper in its entirety out loud in a video I uploaded to YouTube on my YouTube channel here, that link being in the actual article on my Medium profile. One important feature of this paper to note is that Friedman himself agreed with Mayer's novel interpretation in comments he made in a 1990 draft version of this paper which Mayer had sent to him. Furthermore, his comments in an interview with Daniel Hammond in 1988 about his methodology are also in alignment with Mayer's thesis in this paper. Understanding Friedman's true intentions, the practical utility of unrealistic assumptions. Mayer's paper explains that Friedman's controversial stance, the unrealistic assumptions, should be interpreted through a practical lens. Use this to argue that the assumptions in neoclassical economics, though seemingly unrealistic, serve a functional purpose in generating useful predictions. Mayer clarifies, quote, on a soft reading, Friedman's plea for unrealistic assumptions becomes much more defensible, and Friedman's essay is broadly consistent with the methodology that most economists now affirm, at least in principle. End of quote. Fat assumptions versus necessary assumptions. Pivotal concept in understanding Friedman's methodology is the distinction between fat assumptions and necessary assumptions. This differentiation is crucial because it addresses the common critique that neoclassical economics relies on unrealistic assumptions. By elucidating this distinction, we can better appreciate the practical utility of economic theories, even when their assumptions appear to diverge from reality. Fat assumptions are those that are broader than necessary for the theory's core hypotheses. They serve primarily as expository tools. Necessary assumptions, on the other hand, are the fundamental conditions required for the theory's validity. Recognizing this distinction allows us to evaluate economic theories more accurately, focusing on their predictive power and empirical implications rather than getting bogged down by the realism of every assumption. Here is a detailed exposition of this idea, as brilliantly articulated in Thomas Mayer's soft reading of Friedman's methodology of positive economics. Quote, to illustrate with a simple example, consider the assumption that firms maximize profits and its implication that they set output at the point where marginal revenue equals marginal costs. Suppose someone unfamiliar with economic theory were to observe that marginal revenue equals marginal costs and were to use that as the assumption of an economic theory. This theory would then have the implication that firms maximize profits. Friedman then points out that there's a serious problem in testing such a hypothesis by the truth of its assumptions. As discussed above, such a test is valid only if the assumptions are strictly necessary for the hypothesis. As in the previous example, all that may be required is that marginal costs rise locally, not that they rise everywhere. For this reason, Friedman plays down the role of tests by the truth of assumptions. But all the same, his formulation does provide a role for testing by necessary assumptions. As Friedman points out, a problem in testing a theory by its necessary assumptions is that what is a necessary assumption for one use of the theory may not be a necessary assumption for another use of the theory. Friedman's example is the assumption of perfect competition that is made in much of neoclassical theory. This assumption may be perfectly adequate when the theory is used to predict the effect of an excise tax on prices in a certain industry, but not when deciding whether the industry has violated the antitrust laws. Similarly, the monetarist assumption that the Fed can be held responsible for inflation because it can control the growth rate of money can be correct, even if Moore in 1988 correct that banks, and hence the Fed, cannot contract deposits. All that is required is the subsidiary assumption that the Fed could control inflation just by lowering the growth rate of deposits without having to make it negative. If the assumption that the central bank can control the money supply could be invalid if tested in isolation, and yet be valid as a foundation for a theory that blames the Fed for inflation. Ceteris paribus, it might be better to use assumptions that are valid for all sorts of situations, but such more general theory may not be available or may lack simplicity. Thus, Friedman's strictures against testing by the validity of assumptions are actually not extreme and are probably acceptable to most mainstream economists. In their day to day work, most economists are willing to sacrifice the details of specific situations to provide their hypotheses with greater range. Similarly, they are willing to relinquish surface plausibility. Indeed, the belief that one must dig below the surface of appearances is what motivates the serious study of economics. Economists are aware that some parts of their assumptions are merely expository devices, so that their truth is not crucial. Hence, when suitably interpreted, even the seemingly radical aspects of Friedman's essay are not so extreme. End of quote. The last part of this long quote is so important it is worth restating. Mayer is saying that economists often use assumptions as practical tools to simplify complex realities and make theories more broadly applicable. These assumptions do not always need to be true in a literal sense. Instead, they serve to focus on the essential elements needed to generate useful predictions and insights. By differentiating between necessary assumptions that are crucial for a theory's core hypotheses and fat assumptions that are broader and more flexible, we can appreciate the methodological sophistication in Friedman's approach. When viewed through this lens, the seemingly radical aspects of Friedman's essay appear more reasonable and are aligned with the practical needs of economic research. Next section. What does all of this have to do with behavioral economics again? I know I can get a little carried away at times, especially when it comes to applied epistemology, methodology, and Milton Friedman. So here's the connection. Because the rationality assumptions are just that, assumptions, they can't test neoclassical economics hypotheses. Only how well these hypotheses predictions um, do in the real world can do that. As a result, behavioral economists will have to produce their own alternative hypotheses about how markets work in general that are capable of being falsified, and then actually do the work of subjecting those hypotheses to repeated rigorous testing across different countries with different types of data sets over different time horizons, then attempt to replicate those studies if they are consistent with these hypotheses. Unfortunately for behavioral economics scholars and other economists who would like to be able to rely on behavioral economics scholarship, as it turns out, as I have shown in the section of the Part 2 article in this series called The Law of No Numbers, there have been examples in the behavioral economics and behavioral law and economics literature in which explanations have been accepted due to repetition of citation combined with appeals to authority of the original author who proposed, if you can even call it that really, Thaler is just speculating in that example, these theories and explanations. Next section. Moving forward. Call to rigor. Behavioral economics, while offering valuable insights into human behavior, must adhere to the same stringent standards of empirical validation as neoclassical economics. It is not enough to highlight deviations from rationality. Behavioral economics scholars must develop robust, falsifiable hypotheses that can withstand rigorous and repeated testing. This involves 1. Developing generalizable theories, that is, crafting theories that can explain market behaviors across various contexts and are not limited to isolated anomalies. 2. Empirical rigor, ensuring hypotheses are subjected to rigorous empirical tests using diverse data sets spanning different countries and time periods. 3. Reproducibility, prioritizing the replication of studies to confirm the reliability and validity of their findings. The end.